And so I actually think balancing the focus on acquisition with the focus on loyalty is really where you can build an enduring business. And at the earliest stages, that's typically not a topic that comes up. It comes up in year 3, 4, 5 when you're realizing that the acquisition's getting harder, that you have a leaky bucket, you're trying to address it. If you can pull that up and make it something that's part of the DNA of the company, of how you treat the customers that you have as well as the customers that you want to have, that can help you stand out.
Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models. This podcast expresses our views as of the date published and does not represent the views of and is not endorsed by any company for which we work.
We are excited to welcome Jason Bornstein, a partner of Forerunner, where he's also the newly appointed head of research. For those that are unfamiliar, Forerunner is an early-stage consumer-driven VC firm. Starting his career as a growth marketer at Bonobos, an early Forerunner portfolio company, Jason later joined Forerunner as a principal on the investment team. As a recently promoted partner, Jason leads market research at Forerunner to help project trends, consumer behaviors, and market shifts that inform the investment strategy and help drive portfolio growth. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. And to start, it would be great if you could walk us through your initial interest in marketing and research and why you decided to start your career in that field. Maybe touching on your first job and then transitioning to the team at Bonobos.
It may not look like it from my resume, but I actually consider myself to have been an underdog for most of my career. I grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis in a place where most people's parents were doctors or lawyers or had a family business. So I wasn't exposed to tech. I wasn't exposed to investing, consulting, a lot of these professions that people pursue out of school. So I've constantly felt like I've been trying to make up ground and aim to prove what I'm capable of and defy expectations. Layer on that, graduating during the Great Recession. I'm sure that's on a lot of people's minds that are coming out of school, whether it's graduate school or undergrad. I experienced that. I don't know that I understood the gravity of it. That's like a long-winded way of saying I didn't necessarily by design aim to get into marketing. But what I was able to do is find that corner of marketing that resonated with me. So more on the performance analytical side and customer insights, and really tried to use that to create this training ground for myself that I saw other people getting in other places where they had cohorts of people. But really the through line, of getting to Bonobos and then some of the advertising work I did before and working at a gay rights nonprofit for a little bit was this idea of working at startups in early stage companies. And then that really transitioned and lines up well to my time at Forerunner and the shift towards research.
Awesome. And we'll definitely get into that. But I think one of the cool things that you did at Bonobos, which for those who don't know, a men's clothing brand, you really built out their marketing playbook, the strategy behind that. And so how did you think through that playbook and take advantage of some of these first mover principles, such as podcast marketing, for example?
So when I joined Bonobos, it was in 2012. The company had been around for 5 years. And I share that because it just underscores at that time, it was quite easy to build a brand online. There wasn't a lot of noise. We could cut through the noise and we were able to build something that resonated with people. It was hard to build a business because no one had done it before. There was very few companies like us that were building a digital first brand. And so we did have some of these first mover advantages, but we also did not have a lot of the softwares that have lowered the barrier to entry and made it easier and faster for people to get started. So when I joined the business 5 years in, it might look like what a company would look like 1 to 2 years in today. It's just a difference of how quickly things have been able to move. We were early on Facebook. That had started before I had gotten there, and then graduated into doing Instagram ads once they started. It was novel, cheap. We could spend a good amount of money, and many other people weren't advertising on there. Actually, what the secret sauce ended up being was challenging some of my and some of the team's biases against traditional marketing channels that work well in retail. So stores are guide shops. I was there when we just had one guide shop in our office that people could come to shop. And then by the time I left, I think there was 30 or 40. and catalog was the other one. So I took our catalog from being a 50K test that I begrudgingly did, thinking, why are we doing this? This isn't going to make any sense, to a $7 or $8 million budget in a 2 to 3 year period. It became our largest acquisition channel and highest quality acquisition channel. And then pairing that with the guide shops, both just provided high touch experiences where we could sell the brand, but also tell the brand story.
And it's also getting harder and harder nowadays, especially for D2C brands, and to keep CAC at a reasonable rate, to have that CAC to LTV ratio at least at a 3. And so maybe at like a macro level, can you touch on some of the strategies around growth marketing and new strategies companies are deploying in this highly competitive environment?
What we're seeing, a lot of our portfolio companies at Forerunner entered into wholesale fairly late in their trajectory. What we're seeing now is companies do that earlier and starting to diversify across channels. It can help with brand building, especially if you're seeing a pull in the market from the buyers at these stores. And it can also mitigate risk when the online channels are not working as well as they could, because these things ebb and flow. Like things work and then don't work, and you want to be able to have different opportunities that you can pursue. So that's one big shift that we're seeing right now. I mean, it's played out in our portfolio with Glossier launching in Sephora, Rituals in started in Whole Foods. Hind and Hers is selling in a bunch of places like Target. So more people selling in those channels earlier. The other is, I would say, is turning the thinking on its head a bit, where to me right now, acquisition is table stakes. You have to be good at it online. You have to figure out how to make it work for you, whatever channel you're pursuing. It's harder to create an advantage there. It's not impossible, but it's much harder to. And so I actually think balancing the focus on acquisition with the focus on loyalty is really where you can build an enduring business. And at the earliest stages, that's typically not a topic that comes up. It comes up in year 3, 4, 5 when you're realizing that the acquisition is getting harder, that you have a leaky bucket, you're trying to address it. If you can pull that up and make it something that's part of the DNA of the company, of how you treat the customers that you have as well as the customers that you want to have, that can help you stand out.
It makes a ton of sense. Some of your brands have done a really good job of doing that. I think the makeup space is extremely saturated, but Glossier still maintains their household name. I'm actually wearing it right now. Pairing your background in marketing to now your role at Forerunner, which we'll get into more of the research intricacies in a bit, but how does your current focus on research illustrate like an evolution of the marketing expertise that you built early on in your career?
It's not something that I could have predicted, to be honest. It wasn't the path that I had charted for myself. It's something that revealed itself over time. Marketing was a piece of that. And specifically on the hypothesis testing, the analytical part of it, the storytelling part of it, I also spun up the customer insights function at Bonobos. It was really just me and trying to show people the value of that and trying to be involved in conversations as early as possible. And then when I went on to business school, they hired a few people to take on that and build it out. So this goes all the way back to me being in high school and being a journalist and being editor in chief and storytelling and reporting and narrative building. Like it's a constellation of things for me versus setting out and saying, this is exactly what I want to do. In a lot of ways, my new role as a partner and a head of research at Forerunner is an N of one role. You don't see it often, especially at early stage companies. That's actually the most invigorating part of this, because I'm going to shape this really closely with our team to think about how this can be an advantage for us.
It's very exciting and in a unique role, as you mentioned. You're starting to see a lot of venture capital firms build out platform teams, but specifically on the early stage side and seeing someone focusing on research, I think is exciting. It's a great transition into understanding what drove your decision to move into investing from the marketing side of things. Obviously, there's sales and marketing is a huge part and huge expense and part of scaling tech businesses. But obviously, it's slightly different from your background at Bonobos, being able to make decisions and make bets on businesses. So just talk us through your transition from the actual marketing operating role into an investing role.
I made this transition by going to business school. For me, that was going back to what we were talking about at the beginning. That was the opportunity to reset and to say, what are the opportunities that I didn't get to explore coming out of undergrad that I wish I had had a chance to? And that's the real talk of it. And I share that because I think that's what a lot of people go through at various points in their career. So for me, it was done through business school. And I've talked to a lot of business school students. VC is a shiny object. It was shiny for me too. I came in thinking, wow, wouldn't it be awesome to do this job? It's a very privileged role. I tell people to try it out as quickly as you can once you get to school or whatever capacity you can, because a lot of people don't end up liking it. And it's a quite different job from what people realize it is. What ended up resonating with me, and I had the ability to work with the Forerunner team, get to know them. We really jived well together. I got to experience the role before committing to a full time job. To me, it was the open ended and evolving nature of the role. We don't know what the future is going to hold exactly. We're looking forward, not backwards. And that means that every week, every month, each fund looks different. There's some things that are through lines and consistent. But I like the idea of always being on my toes. Part of that's around learning just the market. Part of that is learning the role. No deal, no company, no founder is the same. And so you have to adapt how you approach situations. And you're piecing together information and you're becoming more sophisticated in your thinking over time. But I really like that. I also like that I could partake in the upside of my work. This is a profession, not the only profession, where if you do a good job, there can be good outcomes. That's not the only factor. The thing I like to tell people that maybe I didn't appreciate going into this is like, this isn't a get rich quick profession. Funds are 10-year cycles and you work tirelessly. And I think maybe the hardest part when you're entering the role for the first time is there's not a lot of objective feedback about how good you are. You have to wait a long time and you have to be patient and think about that. You have to consider that when you're entering the role. And these are things that I like wish I had known at the time. I ended up in a really good place with an amazing team and ended up in this research role that I'm thrilled to be in, but it wasn't so clear to me that this is exactly what I needed to do.
I think that's great advice. And I think it's a good transition to maybe just for context, give people an understanding of what the investment strategy is at Forerunner, because it's even longer of an investment horizon than some other venture capital strategies.
Yes. So we're an early stage firm. We're investing out of $1 billion fund. Half of that is allocated towards early stage. So seed, Series A, primarily in the early stage. And then we have the ability to support existing portfolio companies and make select new investments out of the growth fund. When I say consumer, this is a lens for how we're analyzing the market. It's really core to our philosophy. It's holding the consumer as our North Star and thinking about what's going on with people, where we think that's headed, and what opportunities does that create? Where can meaningful businesses be built? It's not meant to be business model or sector specific. So we invest across B2B, B2C, marketplaces, services, product companies, subscriptions. It's really quite broad in that sense, but that North Star of people and the consumer is what connects our work.
And you came in at the principal level, which is fairly unique across venture capital. Usually you see folks that come up having done some investing before coming in at that level. So just talk us through coming in kind of your first year at the principal level, and then also just what you felt it took to be elevated to the partner level and the unique skills and attributes you need to make that jump.
I joined Forerunner about 10 years into my career. It was a unique and atypical setup. And part of that was reflected in my ability to start as a principal. The Forerunner team is small. I got to know them over time. They got to know me. We also had this shared experience of having worked on Bonobos together. And so there was a familiarity there, and I had been able to show what I was capable of in terms of thesis building, really, was a lot of it. And a lot of the research work that I'm doing now is stuff that I did in the early days. I started with a lot of the associate analyst level responsibilities. That's something that everybody at Forerunner does when they get started. Yuri, who's been at the firm from the earliest days, started out as a principal, doing a lot of the work that I did and a lot of the work that the three associates that we have now started doing too. So this is logging deals, passing on deals, owning the deal list, things like that, that are more like foundational. And some of it is routine tasks, but it's what makes this business work. And it shows how we think and approach. So I did that and then got up the learning curve and was gradually taking on more responsibilities. And that starts to shift towards, leading more diligence efforts. There's not an expectation of sourcing right away, but you start to turn that on after a bit. And then that graduates to, being more involved in portfolio companies.
And I'm sure growing your network too, because once you're in and you're at a higher level, you have other principals and partners sharing deals with you, which hopefully builds your track record. And then hitting the partner level is kind of how I see the build. But I'm curious, you mentioned earlier, I mean, the head of research is pretty unique. And a lot of firms are doing thesis building, but a lot of times it's 25% of my time this week is going to be doing it, or another investor. And so I'm curious, a few highlights of your new role as head of research, and why did Forerunner decide to carve that role out? Do you have operating partners as well, or kind of where does it fit in the mix?
We have a portfolio success team that includes talent, includes comms and marketing. We also have a data person, Luke, and myself on research. We're actually more integrated into the investing team. That's part of the what's special about this setup is that we're all working together. We're not sitting outside. So I still join for all of the deal meetings when founders are coming in to pitch because it's important for me to be picking up those bits of information and conversation to inform our research. I mean, for me, I think about in the ideal case, we're we're building a mental file of here's companies that we've seen, here's people that we've met, here's articles that we've read, here's conversations that we've had, here's what we've learned from the portfolio. And all of that is coming together. And then at a certain point, the file reaches a critical mass and you say, let's jump off and do some work here. And hopefully that's like the first step to defining our perspective on an area of interest and really creating a blueprint for here's what we think is going on and here's how we will evaluate companies. I mean, it's not meant to be a static thing, it'll evolve over time. I think our digitally native franchise work that I worked on with Brian and Alex on our team is an excellent example of this, where we had come up with this idea of what we think is a new novel business model for how franchises can exist online. And I can share more about this, but essentially, we started at the early stages. It's already led to 3, maybe 4 investments. That's the ideal series of how this will work, in partnering with the senior most members of the team to scope out where are we wanting to spend time, what do we want to prioritize.
That's a good transition into understanding maybe where you've spent time recently at Forerunner from the investment side of things. Obviously, you've helped work on investments in Sunday, Eclipse, and a few others, and notice that they're all fairly different business models and different businesses. But I'd love to hear in your words, kind of what's the common thread that have tied these opportunities together in your mind, and going forward, kind of where are you excited to spend time and potentially deploy capital?
It actually, I think, is like the perfect demonstration of Forerunner's thematic focus and practice. It can be across business models, it can be across categories. That's the through line, is the consumer as our North Star on all of this, and matching that up with where we think there's opportunity to build companies that matter. So you're totally right. Between those companies, Eclipse, Sunday, Ampla, at surface level, you might not think that there's a lot in common with them. But for us, it's like that's how we're energized in this space, right? It's quite diverse. It evolves over time. And then as a partner, you can have a portfolio of things that are connected in some ways, but also different. In terms of areas where we're spending time, so I mentioned the digitally native franchise piece. That's an important one for us. We've made some initial investments. We hope to make more.
Can you break down what that means for the group specifically?
So this is a reflection on looking back over the last decade or so of venture investing and seeing 2 popular business models emerge, and then there being some clear upsides and downsides of those business models. So on the one hand, you had managed marketplaces, think DoorDash, think Uber. They are marketplace models. They have a lot of control. They're making it easy for their supply to come in and start to make money. The challenge is that the supply is the one that creates all the value, but in that setup, all the value so far has accrued to the platforms. DoorDash and Uber are big companies. The drivers are not doing so well. You see that in a lot of the news articles that come up, right? So it's a trade off. And you're saying, I'm willing to give up making more money for being able to plug in somewhere and do something easily. On the other hand, you have vertical SaaS or business in a box. Shopify is a good example of this, but you've got others like that are building like Mindbody or some building in the beauty space like Squire, Gloss Genius. These companies are creating software that makes it easier for people to run their own business. The value is actually mostly created by the software, but a savvy operator can build a really effective business, right? And they capture the upside and the value accrues to them. If you think about Shopify, it's a big company, right? Like 50, 60, $70 billion market cap. But think about all the businesses that have built on top of that and the market cap of those businesses. And does that feel like a fair distribution of value capture? And so what we wanted to say was, okay, let's look at business model that we know works offline, franchises. And it's not just the McDonald's of the world, because there's many categories, service ones too, that have franchise model, and say, how do we bring that online? How do we empower people to work for themselves and have a shared responsibility and shared upside between the platform and the individual? And so a lot of these categories where we're seeing this are ones where it can be an individual providing a service. They could build a small team over time. We have investments in the home services space here and a few other categories as well in the nutrition space.
Another way that, and a similar note, that Forerunner has developed that a value add to their portfolio companies and working closely is with the brand power score tool. So I think first, maybe touching on the tool, how you developed it to quantify essentially a brand's strength. What's really the ROI for the brands that are using it?
So Brand Power Score we launched earlier this year. That one was a reflection on we've made nearly 150 investments as a firm over the past 10 years, most of them in companies that had a brand. I don't mean that they were selling products necessarily, that was part of it, but that brand was a critical part of what they were building. And so we're often asked, how do you spot breakout brands early before they break out? And we were trying to codify our learnings here and share them with people so that they could start to have conversations internally about what they want their brand to look like. And I think this is a way to be actionable and deliberate. There's other metrics that people track, like awareness or net promoter score, that are important pieces of this puzzle too. They're a little bit less actionable. They're a little bit more lagging indicators. It doesn't get specific enough of how do people think of me on this dimension. And so that was the intention. And when we launched it, we had tremendous reception in the market and also in our portfolio too, of people just wanting to gut check where they're at. I mean, this is something that changes over time too. We saw in our portfolio, for example, the farmer's dog, they had a really high, impressive brand power score across all of the six dimensions. They launched a Super Bowl ad this past year that was beloved and brought them a lot of press and really good sentiment in the market. And we could measure that bump after in the brand power score.
What exactly are the inputs, if you don't mind sharing? Is it more focused on actual data from traffic, or if you were to describe what makes up that score, what are the important factors?
So it's six key dimensions, and you're going out and you can either ask your customers or you can ask general population, where you'll find some customers and you'll find some non-customers. I draw that distinction because I think in the earliest days when you're building a company, you have some customers, but you have more people that you want to be customers. And that's almost the opportunity, is what do they think of you? What do your customers think of you and how does that compare? So this is, you can actually go out and send a survey. It's a 6-question survey and it's asking about, the 6 dimensions are feeling, reliability, experience, North Star, differentiation, and identity. And so you ask a specific question about each one of those. It's on a very strongly agree to strongly disagree scale. And then it's a percentage, similar like net promoter score, where you're subtracting the agrees versus the disagrees and then averaging those scores together. We wanted to keep it simple, but also like nuanced enough that people could really dig in and see where do they spike and where do they want to spike.
And how would a 2012 Bonobos scale?
I would say high on feelings and high on identity. We were talking to men in a way that they hadn't been talked to in this category, because most, you think about our competitors where guys would go to shop, a lot of them were women's brands that had men's clothes. And so that's what drew me into the company, was they had emails that had pun subject lines and they were fun, right? I'd never seen anything like it before. On that point, like feeling and identity were clear. Reliability, like I said, it was hard to build a business.
What are the core ways that a company can work to improve its brand power score? I'd imagine you have portfolio companies or other companies maybe outside the portfolio that have come to you and realize that their score is lacking in one area or another. How do you recommend that brands improve that score or improve certain areas?
What I will say is that for us, like what we noticed, because we went out and we tracked, a handful of at scale brands in our portfolio to start, and then 100 plus brands. If you were to go and look at best brands lists and Google that, we took a cross section of those companies to try to be objective. Like, here are what other people are saying are the best brands. How do they hold up when you look at it in the brand power score? And across the board, reliability was almost always the highest letter score for a brand. So that just illustrates to us that that's table stakes. You're putting something out there and you're delivering on what you said you're going to do and what people expect. The hardest one was North Star and feeling, which when you think about like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that's sort of as you're getting towards the top there, and it's an amalgamation of a bunch of things working together. I think that this is a cross-functional effort. So I encourage people to start to track it over time, see where it's at and how it changes, and have this be a cross-functional conversation. This isn't a marketing specific thing. This is something that we hope that founders and CEOs are engaged in, that the operations and customer service team, the tech product team are engaged in. And I think each one of them has different ways to move the needle. And it can be something as simple as putting out an excellent ad. It can be something as simple as in the case of Budweiser making a mistake, right? Or Southwest, right? That was another one that we tracked. We tracked it about a year ago, and then when they had the meltdown during the holidays last year, reliability tanked for them.
I was going to say it's interesting because now, I mean, we brought on a brand called Perfect Head. It's a canned matcha drink in the UK. And they've really done a good job of just nailing the consumer marketing strategy in terms of appealing to the consumer so they can hopefully have that feeling to purchase by just honestly making relatable videos. I mean, they've been driving a lot of like short form clips, and this is what we do in the office every day. This is what we do on our weekends. And just that level of relatability, they've seen some pretty good success from it.
Yeah, that's key. The relatability part and the emotional connection it talks on the feeling one dimension, and it talks on the identity dimension as well. Ultimately, you need to have that as an underpinning.
Well, that's a good note to transition into our last two questions. And the first is, what motivates you to work hard?
For me, I think back to, and some of this sounds silly when I go back that far, but I have these seminal memories of like just falling short of something I really wanted. And it happened over and over again. And those have stuck with me. Decades later, this is actually the chip on my shoulder. It's like feeling like the underdog, like I mentioned at the beginning. And it's this desire to prove myself. It's really innate, it's not achievement oriented. It's this idea of like feeling underestimated, feeling like I have something to prove, and wanting to do that.
Definitely. I mean, that you kind of are partially answering the next question, which is a piece of advice that you'd give your younger self.
Bet on yourself and stay true to yourself. Don't settle and be patient. If you're fortunate enough to be in the position where you can wait to find a thing that resonates with you, where you can take a bet on yourself while also staying true to yourself, that's a good thing.
It's a great note to end on and great advice generally for the listeners. Jason, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your perspectives and thoughts on brand and Forerunner and sharing your journey. It's been a blast.
Thank you both. I appreciate it. Good conversation.